Again, Mrs. Beeman, just let me tell you how sorry I am for your loss. Clive Henderson put on his best compassionate face, the one he'd perfected over the years, and added, "We will take good care of Stephen." We, being a bit of a stretch. After all, it was just him running Henderson's funeral home since his father had died so many years ago. But Clive often thought of the two of them still working together, so what could you do? "You're so kind, Clive," she said, wiping a tear from her eye. "I know you'll do right by Stephen." Well, she had no clue that her husband was a philanderer who went through prostitutes like corn through a pig, not to mention he owed Clive over $1,000 from their weekly poker game. The world was better off without him, at least in Clive's estimation. "I'll take good care of your dear husband, you can be sure of that," he said, standing up and ushering the old lady out the front door, thinking, "All right, let's get a move on. I've got work to do." He'd been waiting for old Steve to kick the bucket for over a year and was anxious to get started on him. A few minutes later, he was in the basement in the embalming room, getting the body ready. He chuckled to himself as he removed the sheet to expose the former pillar of the community, the guy who had put Fox Hollow Bank on the map, the same guy who would smile at you one minute and stab you in the back the next. Not only was the guy a jerk, but wow, what a huge and unbelievably wrinkled hunk of flesh the man had developed over the years. Clive smiled. This was going to work out perfectly. Clive was good at his job. He was an introvert by nature, and from an early age had been drawn to dead people. He loved preparing them for their show, as he called it, only to himself, of course, and his father not only recognized but encouraged his son's passion. "You'll go far in this business," he'd told Clive more than once. "Just don't get too carried away." "Carried away? What do you mean?" "You should develop a hobby, son. There's more to life than death, you know." Not to Clive. He tried butterfly collecting, raising worms to sell as bait, even attempted a brief but unfulfilling foray into taxidermy. However, they all failed to fulfill his father's wish for him to have a well-rounded life. So his father finally sighed and gave up. "Well, just don't get too attached to dead people." "I'll try, Dad," Clive said, knowing that it would be impossible. Shortly thereafter, his father died, and Clive outdid himself getting him ready for the show. At the funeral, everybody said so. "He looks almost like he's alive," was the general consensus. Clive thanked everyone politely, but deep down he was beaming. He had to admit his dad really had looked remarkably lifelike. Since his mother had died when he was quite young, Clive Henderson, at the relatively young age of 25, became the youngest funeral home director in the state. As the years went by, he continued to hone his craft, his skills becoming much sought after, not only to mention admired. He really did have a knack for making the dead look good. As business flourished, Clive became a well-respected member of the community. He also developed a hobby. He found he had an aptitude for gardening, specifically growing vegetables, tomatoes in particular. He looked at his hobby with a scientist's eye for detail, much as he prepared his clients for the show. He toyed around with soil and tested it for its acidic content. He tried various nutrients and mulches. He experimented with various types of plant food. After a few years, as his vegetable garden flourished, he began to enter local garden contests and started winning awards for his juicy, tasty tomatoes. As much as he enjoyed winning, he continued to look for new ways to improve both their quality and their taste. He started using wood ash to increase the potash content and really hit it big. Last year, his tomatoes never looked and tasted better. So this year, he was going to try something different. He had been asked to enter his tomatoes at the state fair competition, and he happily agreed. In order to win, he was going to have to pull out all the stops, and he came up with a brilliant idea. If wood ash was so good at promoting the growth of his tomatoes, how about the ashes of humans instead? He'd bet he'd be great, and Steve's big body laying in front of him was going to be his first experiment. He couldn't wait. Yeah, he had a good feeling old Steve would make a nice addition to the garden. No doubt about it. 5 days later, after the funeral, everyone told him how wonderful Steve looked, especially Bettina. "Oh, Clive, I'm so thankful for what you did. Steve never looked better." "He was a wonderful man. He'll be missed by many," Clive said, sounding perfectly solemn, doing an admirable job of hiding his desire to gag. After all, he was a professional. "Now, if you'll excuse me," he said, turning ever more solemnly aside, "I've got to get Stephen ready for his final journey." He wheeled the casket into the back room of the chapel and covered it with a tarp. Then he wheeled an identical casket out to the hearse, loaded it into the back with the help of 4 pallbearers, and took it to the graveyard. When the service was over, he drove back to the chapel, loaded Steve into the hearse, and took him back to the funeral home. Working quickly, he removed the body and got it ready for the crematorium, started it up. 8 hours later, the ashes were ready. Later, on the evening of the next day, he took the ashes out to the garden and spread them around his tomato plants. Then he carefully watered the soil, watching as the ashes mingled with the dirt. 3 months later, he proudly placed his first-place trophy on the fireplace mantel in the reception area for the funeral home. "Success," he grinned. "Those ashes were just what I needed to win." He sat down at his desk and smiled. He was really on to something. The town had a good supply of old people, and the funeral business had never been better. In fact, he knew of a few people he was convinced wouldn't last until the end of the year. He knew exactly what he was going to do with them. He'd already been asked back to the state fair for next year, and he was planning not only on going, but also on winning. All he needed was some human ash, and he knew exactly where he'd go to get it. It'd be easy.